Throughout this series on Lamentations, I've been referring to Kathleen O'Connor's book, The Lamentations and the Tears of the World. I haven't brought it for show and tell yet, but I've been referring to it. I've also been referring to a commentary that she wrote about a year or two after this book came out. O'Connor is a retired seminary professor and Old Testament scholar, and I believe she's still alive. I don't know. In the preface to this book, published in 2002, she writes about how she began, or where she was when she began working on Lamentations. She was in the oncology waiting room at Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center in New York City. Let that sink in for a second. The oncology waiting room in the hospital. She was this Old Testament professor working on Lamentations. Her husband was receiving treatments. The outcome was far from certain. And in that context, she writes, the worlds of the text, the cancer center, and my own inner being crossed over and replicated parts of one another in startling loops of communication. What she wrote was real. What she studied was what she was living. Pain and struggles are universal. So is that feeling of helplessness. I picture Professor O'Connor writing about loss and struggles while sitting there in that room. She was born in 1942, so she would have been around 60 when she was writing. And a tenured professor, living, reading, breathing, researching, teaching, and having her life in an ivory tower might seem like she lived this charmed, removed life. Yet here she was, sharing in the despair that is universal, sharing in the despair that the ancient Israelites experienced, sharing your pain and mine. She wasn't trying to imagine it. She wasn't studying it with some sort of distance, with an arm's length where she could sort of disassociate herself with the reality. There she was. She was living it. And here's the thing, so do we. Everyone experiences pain. Everyone experiences loss. And this is why Lamentations can speak to all of us. Even, it doesn't matter where you are, even students who are beginning this new semester full of hope and enthusiasm. Everyone is a part of reality. No one can escape from it. And this short Old Testament book is an invitation to cry out, to be honest with God, and to share our human experience with one another. Lamentations comes out of grief that's tied to a specific event, the Babylonians' destruction of Jerusalem. This is our third week in this series, and I've mentioned that, 587 before the Common Era. This was a defining moment in the history of ancient Israel. These people lost everything, and it shocked their faith. This loss was told in 2 Kings. There we find a description with names and places. But here in Lamentations, it's that same story, but it's retold through poetry. Chapter 1 was about Lady Zion. Chapter 2 had daughter Zion. Chapter 3 looked at blaming God for the fall of Jerusalem. And here in chapter 4, we see a comparison between how things used to be. Remember when? Remember how it was, contrasted with how they were experiencing it now. It's an exploration into loss. Things were good, but now they're bad. For anyone who's experienced loss, this book is an honest look at where things are compared to where they used to be. For O'Connor, sitting there in the hospital waiting room, the placid life of a distant scholar was over, if it ever existed. I don't know that much about her life, but she faced the kind of pain written about on these pages, just like we all do. The chapter begins, how the gold has grown dim. This is the darkness that accompanies a sense of loss. Why do they grow dim? Why do things grow dim? They grow dim because of that pain. They grow dim because things go off the rails. Chapter 4 is reminiscent of those first 3 chapters. Like the earlier chapters, the poetic interpretation of the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem is that it's God's fault. They saw God as the primary agent of destruction who deliberately and actively unleashed anger upon the city. However, the poetry isn't supposed to be read as a code. It's not the final word. It shows us what we can say. It gives us license to be honest and to cry out when things aren't going well, to say whatever is on our mind, and to honestly express our feelings of loss and suffering and despair. This speech reflects 2 things: our honesty and a belief that God is listening. We wouldn't cry out if there was no one up there listening. No matter what happens, it's okay to tell God about it. It's okay to get angry. It's okay to cry out in our speech. And this speech is the sort of divine engagement that God is always seeking from all of us. In our reading in verse 13, we see human complicity in the destruction of Jerusalem. It was for the sins of her prophets and the iniquities of her priests. In other words, the religious establishment had gotten it wrong. They interpreted the destruction to say God is punishing us. The argument moved further than the first 3 chapters. The speaker of chapter 4 uses symbolic language from ancient traditions. It's hyperbole, and it's used to dramatize the heinous nature of the priest's offense. The narrator quotes the people's shouts, "Away, get away! Go away from me, you're unclean, don't touch." That's the kind of speech, according to ancient Jewish laws, that lepers would cry out so that healthy people who came near wouldn't catch their disease. They would keep them safe. Kathleen O'Connor writes, "Lamentations is a mode of prayer and a form of speech that enables people, like us, to tell the truth of their lives and to see the real lives of others in their deprivation, their pain, and their abandonment." It's a practice of truth-telling, and it enables us to express discontent, but it can also create discontent in others. Speaking the truth about life's difficulties is an act of resistance, and it brings each one who dares to speak it out into solidarity with everyone else who has ever suffered. In families of faith like ours, we try to provide one another with a collection of hymns, prayers, poems, other artful speech to talk about lament, to be open, to be honest. When things go bad, when disasters strike, these practices of lament need to already be in place. When we don't take the time to treat our pain with the seriousness it deserves, we cut one another off from a deep and profound spiritual resource. Without the gravity of honest laments, people turn to shallow devotions and to superstitions that may offer little comfort and no mirroring, and may result in denial and repression of all kinds. And that's not only unhealthy, it's no way to live. But here at the end of chapter 4, a little after where our reading ended, there's hope for a future reversal. No matter how dark things become, there's hope. There's a chance for the future. The other day, I was reading in Edward Skillebeck's book, it's called Christ, and came across this following passage. He was writing about the hope we find in Jesus, but he wrote, and I thought this was so appropriate for the end of chapter 4 in Lamentations. It's really interesting when you're reading a Belgian theologian and he suddenly seems to take off his theologian hat and put on his pastoral hat, almost as if he couldn't help himself. And a clip of his sermon worked its way into this massive tome. He writes, "Despite everything, life makes sense. Despite everything, ethics, goodness, and righteousness can be realized. Despite everything, there is hope. Abide in love, even if this love doesn't seem to get anywhere and is vain. Believe in this vain love and existing for others. God loved us when we were still sinners. So God's mercy is greater than all the evil in the world." Lament, but know that the lament is not the end. There is hope. There is love. And God is with us through it all. Amen.